Okay, so if someone said to you, who should do metta, or should I do metta instead of my mindfulness of breathing? Like, how does one choose? How does one choose? Like, I have my little practice in the morning, 20 or 30 minutes. I have to split that up. And this morning I was doing some metta because I know I was interviewing you. But it's, do I split that up? 20 minutes mindfulness, 10 minutes metta? Is it just sort of based on personality or mood? Like, how would you decide that?
Well, I mean, it's either up to you or you're working with a teacher who might make some suggestions for you. And when I went to Burma in 1985 and did 3 months of Metta loving kindness practice, it became a 4-year period in which I only did loving kindness practice because I was intrigued by it. I was challenged by it. I felt tremendous change in me. And then I went back to mostly doing mindfulness. And at the time, I would say I'm mostly doing mindfulness in my formal sitting every day, but I have a commitment to do loving kindness whenever I'm waiting, and I count every mode of transportation as waiting. So taxis, airplanes, walking down the streets of New York. Well, now I'm not doing any of that, and I've gone back to doing much more formal loving kindness. A lot of people split it up. They sort of are designed for different effects, but they work very well together. Mindfulness is really to help us come much closer to our experience, whatever it is, to see it more clearly, not so many veils of delusion, and to understand, what really makes us happy, what brings us suffering, despite what we've been taught. And loving kindness is really designed to help us be a little bit bold, and move out of maybe ruts of attention, like maybe thinking about yourself and only thinking about the mistakes you've made and the problems you have and where you've gone wrong, and moving into other terrain and seeing what it's like, or very much with other people, like all those many people we look right through, that we discount, that we're indifferent to. They play some role in our life, and we just objectify them. So loving kindness invites us in a way to look at them instead of through them.
Yeah, I had a moment today where I was kind of rushing back home to do this interview, and was a homeless person. I was kind of distinctly aware that I was about to interview someone about loving kindness. And it's, well, can I just at least view this person as a human being, even if I'm saying no? And, I was kind of in a hurry to get, I don't want to be late. So it's like, can I at least take that moment of humanity in there? And I do like with Metta that you can kind of crack out a few phrases on the move.
Yeah.
Like one of my personal favorites is immigration officials. I do a lot of traveling, and Russian immigration are the most challenging. They don't smile. They're pretty harsh looking. And as I'm standing there waiting for my passport to be stamped or whatever, I may be happy, maybe well. As much as anything, it passes the time, doesn't it? But it's I'm not sure I could do a really good concentration practice at that point. I'm not going to drop into a full body scan, because at any moment they could open the door, but a few phrases is quite kind of practical at that moment.
Yeah, well, it's like interesting there too, when we, kind of almost like categorize somebody, and we just have expectations that they can't move out of that rigid categorization, and as compared to being somewhat open and listening. Because I used to travel a lot too, not right now, and it would be so interesting, year after year, being asked, well, what do you do for a living? And I'd have to say that weird thing, like, I teach meditation. And occasionally now, going into Ireland, going into England, coming back to the US, people would either say, oh, I'm so stressed out, I could use some of that. Or they'd say, oh, which form? I practice too, So
Times have changed, huh?
Times have changed.
Yeah, it's not just, maybe the Beatles did that. It's, as you say,
That's
same
right.
with yoga, like what kind of yoga people say now. Yeah. Okay. And they're not so distinct as well, are they? Like Metta involves concentration, mindfulness involves Metta, right? They're not quite as distinct.
Yeah, no, they're not so distinct. I mean, mindfulness is such a weird word too. And I see now, because to be mindful of something doesn't just mean you notice it's there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way of being with it. That's what makes it mindful. that you're not rejecting, you're not blaming yourself, you're not ashamed of what you're feeling, you're also not lost in it and overcome by it. There's a certain kind of relationship that is what mindfulness is, and it has a lot of kindness in it, because otherwise we're just judging ourselves constantly. And so I see people struggling now to try to call it something that will convey that, like warm mindfulness or loving awareness or kindfulness or
because the translation of the Pali was just one potential translation, right? Mindfulness from Sati. But it's like sometimes they say on the train, be mindful not to leave your bag on the train. And I think I should be very loving and open about not leaving my bag on the train. And maybe it's a slight misuse. One thing I've heard you talk about in a few interviews, which is a wonderful concept, Papancha. Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to say what that is? So I think it's a lovely idea that's maybe underknown in the mindfulness world.
So the word is in the Pali language, which is the language of the original Buddhist texts, Papancha, and it means proliferation, or as I heard one of the translators of one of my teachers once called it, the imperialistic tendency of mind, where something happens and the entire world is taken over. So the example I usually like to use is a story about my friend, my colleague, Joseph Goldstein, where Joseph and I were teaching together somewhere and just sitting in the kitchen having a cup of tea. And someone came in some distress and said to Joseph, I just had this really terrible experience. And he said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I felt all this tension in my jaw, and I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said, oh, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people, and it's never going to change. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And it was really interesting for me, like watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something like, why are you adding a miserable self-image to a painful experience? It's like painful enough to feel all that tension in our jaw. But on top of that, now we're going to be alone for the rest of our lives. And so it's this cascade. It becomes overwhelming. We feel so defeated, and things are even harder than they would be. It's not that easy to feel the tension in your jaw, but that's what's actually happening.
Right. So go on.
It's just one of the ways we talk about mindfulness. Sometimes we say, look for the add-ons.
So adding on stories, this is going to last forever. This is about me as basic Buddhist suffering things like permanence, and this is about me as a self. This is who I am. This, blah 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 blah. Yep, definitely that. This word Papancha has this quality of da-da-da-da-da-da. There's a kind of nice quality that it's like my mind does this, and then no. It's like the first bit of suffering was just bad luck. The rest of it was me. You know what I mean?
That's true.
Nice.
I may quote you. That was a great way of saying it.
Feel free. I had it a few times today. I had an email today, and I went, hang on a minute. How much of this am I adding to the actual email? The email's bad enough, but I'm adding a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so I love your emphasis on practicality. And my big obsession has always been getting it off the mat, whether it's the aikido mat or the cushion or the yoga mat. How do we go from this Theravadan, monastic, 3 months of mindfulness, 3 months of this, or even 10 days of Goenka, style, to emails and my sister dealing with her screaming kids yesterday, and the daily stuff of life. Say a little bit about your kind of how to get it off the mat, how to get it off the cushion.
Well, I think that was always the intention. Having co-founded a retreat center, the Insight Meditation Society, I really have a lot of respect for that form. I think that it's like an immersion course, either to learn something or to dip back in so fully. Like you want to learn another language and you go to one of those 2-week programs where everyone's speaking that language and that's it. And I love the reality. I mean, so much has fallen away from people right now. It might be a little bit different, but, ordinarily one of the first things that happens if you go on a retreat because you're silent is that you lose some of that identification. Like, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm nobody, whatever it is, because you're not presenting yourself to others and you're just coming close to your own experience. And so there's tremendous things that can happen there. but nobody lives their whole life in retreat. You know, even like the monastic picture you're talking about in Theravadan countries, you know, the monasteries are like communities, you know, and they're hotbeds of all.
Yeah, there's one in Britain, and there's Thai people coming with food every day, and
that's right,
coming and talking about their kids getting into university. It's not so peaceful a lot of the time.
No, not at all. There's always something under construction, and you know, it's like, you know, there's a lot going on. So I think that part of, you know, it's just difficult. It's difficult because the culture is not necessarily so supportive. You know, like if you were in a Theravadan country and you said to your boss, I feel the need to go do a 2-week retreat, it would be probably considered a pretty positive thing. Whatever your position is. Here, it's like too weird, you know? And, you know, you might feel very alone. You might be really ethically challenged at work. You know, I've had students who were just weeping, you know, because they were working for some company and asked to tell lies all the time that were consequential for people, you know, like they were hurting people. And, you know, it's one of the reasons that I think community is very important in the West, so that people don't feel so alone and they can have that kind of support to remember that's what it's all about, is how we live anyway.
And in my experience of retreats was I'd get into wonderful states. I'd learn a lot. They'd be certainly like, wow, I didn't even know it's possible to have a mind like this. You know, I'm sort of crying at the flowers after day 4, you know, on the Metta retreat. And then it's like, whoa. And that's profound and wonderful. I'm glad they exist, and I will continue to do retreats my whole life, I imagine. And I thought, I was surprised at how quickly I lost it, in inverted commas, afterwards. There seemed to be quite a sharp drop off. It seemed to me, as a sort of learning junkie, I'm a learning specialist, that they weren't very good at transfer out of that environment. That seemed to be the weak point to me. So I don't know how we could improve that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a couple of different things. One is, what are we trying to transfer? You know, if it's a state, or especially a state of concentration, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to work out.
And you know, people often say to me, and I use language the same way, but when other people do it, I catch it. Like people say to me, you know, how do I stay mindful all day long at work? Or how can I keep the level of concentration I got in the middle of the retreat? And I always say, it's not going to happen. Yeah. But, you know, think about that very first sitting where you were practicing letting go of the distraction and coming back to the primary object. Let's say the feeling of the breath. We let go and we begin again, and we let go and we begin again. That's the most important lesson probably of the whole thing, because that's what we have to do in life. You know, you get overwhelmed, you get exhausted, you get reactive. Begin again.
And I closed another interview of yours, and I really liked it, because I suspect a lot of people listening to this are like myself. They've done a few retreats, they've done the Grenka, or they've been a Gaia House or Spirit Rock for a couple of weeks or whatever. And then they have this disappointment, and they go, oh, you know, I'm getting attached to it. They can't hold it. And then they can also be this, I won't even call it intermediate stage, but let's say slightly experienced beginner, where it's not so fresh. Like when I sit now, there's a sense of like, I want to get somewhere because I know I can calm my mind. And there's a sort of cynicism or a goal orientation or we're not, you know, what's your advice for those of us who are sort of not meditation virgins anymore, but aren't really, you know, really practitioners who are very, you know, very solid in their practice. So there's a resistance for a lot of us, not total beginners, that I'm noticing.
Well, you know, and that's also an interesting point, to experiment with a different method. I mean, that was when I went to Burma. I've been practicing, you know, very solidly for like 14 or 15 years. And suddenly I was doing a different technique. I didn't know what was supposed to happen. I felt really uncertain about a lot of things. Sayadaw U Pandita was my Metta teacher in Burma. And I remember there was one time we were seeing him, I think 6 days a week for these meetings to describe our practice and get some feedback. And I said something to him, and my voice was so tentative, like, maybe this is happening. I'm not really. And he said, I believe it's happening to you. Why don't you believe it? You know, like I was like thrown back in, you know, to being a beginner. And I began to appreciate that after a while, that there was a fullness and a wholeheartedness that, probably hadn't been there for a while. And so that would be an interesting experiment to make. And just to even realize that is an invitation to begin again in the moment, because it's only the next breath away, it's not like you have to design a remedial course, it's like, oh, here I am, fully here. Oh, look at that.
Yeah, it's sort of like a married love life, isn't it? How do I keep this fresh? And how do I come back to actually, like, romancing my wife as opposed to sort of, oh, it's my wife again. So it's that's not too disrespectful analogy, but yeah. Where do you see most students are at now then? I mean, obviously there's some very experienced people you've worked with, but then there's this particular condition of COVID, the internet, modern life, less and less teachers like yourself who have done, 3 years somewhere, there was a time when all my teachers had been to Asia for a long time. And now if they've been for a month, that's a big deal,
Yeah, or at all.
Meeting mindfulness teachers in Russia who have done a few weekends, and they're sincere and they're nice people, but they've never done a 10-day retreat even, let alone 3 years in Burma. Like, what do you see some of the sort of new challenges we have maybe that aren't quite the same as the time of the Buddha?
Well, I mean, I think, going back to that idea of embodied transmission, I think that's the most, that's like the greatest gift. And I'm sure meeting the Buddha was very different than meeting me, but nonetheless, it is also true that people are teaching who are very sincere and often doing a lot of good, but it's different when you've done a couple of weekend retreats. It just is, I believe. And there's something about that living in the process at the time, even if you're not perfect by any means. Like, one of the funny things about teaching on an app, or recently I was just teaching on Zoom in a conference, and I think I had 6 minutes or something like that. And I said, would you please lead a meditation? So I led a meditation. I led the meditation the way I would. I give an instruction and then I'm silent. And then a few minutes later, I give another instruction. So apparently all these people freaked out and they were writing in the chat, the live stream's broken. I can't hear anything. Silent. What happened to the audio? Silent. She's silent. And the organizer, to her credit, thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. She wrote, the live stream hasn't stopped. You're supposed to stop. And the same thing in apps, I've been told, well, give the instruction, whatever part of the instruction you're giving, and then say, now do it. And then a few minutes later, give the next instruction and say, now do it. And I said, I'm not doing that, because I'm doing it at the time that I'm guiding it. And so I'd rather say in the beginning, when I become silent, that's the cue that you should put into practice what I just said, rather than stopping and starting and stopping and starting. It makes a difference.
Yeah, I've also had students ask for no silence. I've said, can you guide the meditation all the way through? Like, the silence was somehow too much. Some of the younger students, is too challenging somehow. So it's like, can you give us a guide? And maybe there's something in that for complete beginners, because it's a nice anchor for the mind to have a teacher's voice, transmitting state and reminding them. And, something like the conference, it's like people are really spoiled for choice as well, right? Like, you went to one teacher or maybe 2 or 3 teachers, and now we've got, you, Ken Wilber, Shinzen Young, it's just like Judith Blackstone, they're all and it's all there on your computer kind of thing. It can create almost like a bit of a consumer environment,
Yeah. But I think, Zoom is just like the best uniter. Like I just taught today, and people were signing in from Dubai and, all over the world. It was all hours of the day and night, and I thought, isn't that incredible? People are finding some support, in this time.
I feel very grateful for it. And I've been surprised with the conference and other things, how deep people can go in that environment. Be like genuine, like to the point where we had to start warning people. We were like, hey guys, I know it's online, but this could actually get quite emotional, or you might find that happening. So it's sort of pleasantly surprised that is possible.